Billionaire saw her sitting alone at the wedding. Then he whispered, "Be mine for just one night. Before we begin, drop a comment telling us which city you're watching from. And once the story ends, don't forget to rate it from 0 to 10. Oh, and make sure to follow our channel for more stories like this. Now, sit back and enjoy every detail. She shouldn't have come alone, but here she was, watching other people's happiness from the shadows. The wedding reception at the Highlands Inn in Carmel by the Sea sparkled like a jewelry store window, all surface gleam and calculated perfection. Crystal chandeliers cast dancing lights across marble floors, where couples moved in choreographed bliss, their laughter echoing off walls that probably cost more than most people's homes. Livia Moore adjusted the silk fabric of her wine-colored dress and took another sip of champagne that tasted expensive but felt empty. She'd driven 2 hours from San Francisco for this, her best friend's wedding, only to realize she knew absolutely no one here except the bride, who was currently spinning in her new husband's arms like she'd found the answer to every question she'd ever asked. Good for her, Livia thought, and meant it. Someone deserved that kind of certainty. The evening breeze from Monterey Bay carried the scent of jasmine through the open terrace doors, mixing with the low hum of conversations about stock portfolios, vacation homes in Napa, and children attending private schools with names that sounded like law firms. These people spoke in a language Livia knew well, the language of success, of things acquired and positions held. But tonight, it felt like listening to strangers through soundproof glass. She found herself gravitating toward the edge of the reception, where floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of the moonlit coastline. Better to watch the waves than pretend to care about someone's new Tesla or their thoughts on the latest merger in tech. Not enjoying the celebration? The voice came from directly behind her, low, measured with the kind of confidence that suggested its owner was used to being heard the first time he spoke. Livia turned, expecting another networking attempt from someone's husband who'd spotted her standing alone. Instead, she found herself looking up into the darkest eyes she'd ever seen. The man was tall, probably 6'3", with salt and pepper hair that looked like he'd run his fingers through it more than once tonight. His tuxedo fit like it had been tailored specifically for his broad shoulders, but there was something in his posture that suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. Like her. "I don't really know anyone here," she admitted, surprised by her own honesty. "Except the bride. Soren Hayes," he said, extending his hand. "And I don't know anyone here either, including the groom." His handshake was firm, brief, but his fingers lingered just long enough for her to notice they weren't soft like most executives she knew. There were calluses there, old ones, like he'd once worked with his hands before whatever had made him rich enough to belong at a place like this. "Livia Moore." She studied his face, trying to place him. "Are you in business with them?" "Energy sector, renewable development." His answer came with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd given it 1,000 times. "You?" "Corporate law. Contracts, mostly." Something shifted in his expression. Interest, maybe, or recognition of a kindred spirit trapped in the same golden cage of professional obligations and social expectations. They stood in silence for a moment, watching through the windows as waves crashed against the rocks below. The music behind them swelled into something romantic and predictable, and Livia found herself thinking about her empty apartment in San Francisco, the stack of contracts waiting on her desk, the life that felt more like a job description than anything resembling happiness. "Would you like to get some air?" Soren asked quietly. Before she could second-guess herself, before she could remember all the reasons why talking to strange men at weddings was exactly the kind of thing that led to complications, she nodded. They stepped onto the terrace together, leaving the golden light and calculated joy behind them. The ocean wind caught her hair, pulling a few strands loose from their careful arrangement, and for the first time all evening, Livia felt like she could breathe. That's when he turned to her with an expression she couldn't quite read, and said the words that would change everything. "Be mine for just one night." She should have walked away, but something in his eyes made her stay frozen in place. The words hung between them like smoke in the ocean air. Be mine for just one night. Not a question, not quite a demand. Something in between that made Livia's heart skip in a way that had nothing to do with the champagne. Any reasonable woman would have laughed, or been offended, or both. Instead, she found herself studying his face in the moonlight, searching for the predatory gleam she'd learned to recognize in corporate boardrooms and hotel bars. The look that said, "I see something I want, and I always get what I want." But Soren Hayes wasn't looking at her like she was a conquest. He was looking at her like he was drowning, and she might be the only other person who understood what it felt like to go under. "That's quite an opening line," she said quietly, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "Do you use it often?" "Never." The admission came without hesitation. "I don't usually. This isn't something I do." Below them, waves crashed against the rocky coastline with a rhythm that felt more honest than the carefully orchestrated music drifting from the reception. Livia could hear laughter through the glass doors behind them. Bright champagne bubble laughter from people who seemed to have figured out some secret she'd missed. "Why me?" she asked. Soren was quiet for a long moment, his hands gripping the stone balustrade like it was the only thing keeping him anchored. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than before. "Because you look like I feel." The honesty of it hit her somewhere deep in her chest, in a place she'd carefully locked away 6 months ago when her fiancé had left their engagement ring on the kitchen counter with a note that said, "I can't do this anymore," and nothing else. No explanation, no fight, no chance to fix whatever she'd apparently broken. "You look like I feel." Like someone going through the motions of a life that had stopped fitting. Like someone who'd gotten so good at being what everyone else needed that she'd forgotten what she actually wanted. "I should say no," she said, not moving away from him. "Yes, you should. I don't even know you." "No, you don't." The wind picked up, carrying the scent of salt and something flowering from the resort's gardens. Livia's carefully styled hair was coming completely undone now, dark strands whipping across her face, and she didn't bother to push them back. When was the last time she'd let herself look imperfect? When was the last time she'd done something just because it felt right instead of because it made sense? "I'm not looking for complicated," she said finally. "Neither am I." Through the windows behind them, she could see the bride and groom cutting their cake, feeding each other small bites while photographers captured every smile. The fairy tale moment she'd once imagined for herself, back when she still believed in happy endings that lasted longer than a contract term. Soren followed her gaze. "Beautiful wedding." "Yes." The word came out hollow. "Very beautiful." "You don't sound convinced." "I used to be." She turned back to face the ocean. "I used to believe in all of this. The white dress, the promises, the idea that two people could actually keep choosing each other every day until death do them part. What changed your mind?" Livia was quiet for a moment, remembering the sound of their apartment door closing for the last time, the way silence could echo in spaces that used to feel like home. "Reality," she said simply. Something in Soren's expression shifted, understanding maybe or recognition of a wound that matched his own. He moved slightly closer, close enough that she could smell his cologne mixed with the ocean air, close enough to see the fine lines around his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and difficult decisions. "One night," he said again, but this time it sounded less like a proposition and more like a question. "No complications, no promises we can't keep. Just something real." The smart thing would be to say no, to go back inside, find the bride, make appropriate congratulatory noises and drive back to San Francisco where her ordered, predictable life was waiting, where she knew exactly who she was supposed to be. Instead, she found herself looking into those dark eyes that seemed to see straight through every professional mask she'd ever worn, and heard herself say the word that would change everything. Okay. They didn't go to his room. Not yet. Instead, Soren led her down a stone pathway that wound away from the glittering reception, past manicured gardens where jasmine climbed ancient oak trees, toward the sound of waves that seemed to call to something restless in both their souls. "I thought we were going upstairs," Livia said, her heels clicking against the cobblestones as she tried to keep pace with his longer stride. "We are." Eventually, he glanced back at her, something almost vulnerable flickering across his features. "But first, I want to show you something." The path opened onto a secluded stretch of beach where moonlight painted the sand silver, and the Pacific stretched endlessly toward the horizon. Here, away from the wedding's orchestrated perfection, the night felt raw and honest. Just wind and waves and two people who'd somehow found each other in a crowd of strangers. Soren stopped at the edge of the sand and began removing his dress shoes, rolling up the cuffs of his expensive tuxedo pants. The gesture was so unexpectedly boyish that Livia found herself smiling for the first time all evening. "You're going to ruin that suit," she observed. "It's just a suit." He straightened, his socks and shoes dangling from one hand. "Besides, I've ruined more expensive things for less important reasons." There was something in his tone, a weight that suggested stories she couldn't even begin to guess at. Livia hesitated for only a moment before reaching down to unbuckle her own heels, sighing with relief as her feet sank into the cool sand. They walked in comfortable silence for several minutes, the waves washing almost to their toes before retreating with a soft hiss. The reception's music faded to nothing behind them, replaced by the ancient rhythm of ocean meeting shore. "Tell me something real," Soren said suddenly. "What do you mean? Something you don't put in your professional bio. Something that matters." Livia considered the question as they navigated around a piece of driftwood that looked like it had traveled halfway around the world to end up here. In the corporate world, she was used to careful revelations, strategic vulnerability designed to build rapport while maintaining professional distance. This felt different, more dangerous. "I haven't cried in 8 months," she said finally. "Not once. Not even when my engagement fell apart. Not when my father had his heart attack, not when I got promoted to senior partner and realized I felt absolutely nothing about it." Soren nodded like this made perfect sense to him. "Survival mode. Is that what you call it?" "It's what my therapist called it. Back when I still went to therapy." He kicked at a shell, sending it skittering toward the waves. "Before I decided that feeling nothing was easier than feeling everything wrong." They'd stopped walking without realizing it, standing at the water's edge where foam swirled around their ankles like liquid starlight. The vulnerability in his admission hung between them, more intimate than any physical touch could have been. "What happened?" Livia asked softly. "To put you in survival mode?" For a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. His jaw worked silently, and she could see him weighing how much truth was too much for a woman he'd known for less than an hour. "My daughter," he said finally. "Chloe. She's 7 now, and I haven't seen her in 2 years. The words came out flat, matter-of-fact, but Livia could hear the raw pain underneath. She knew that tone, the voice of someone who'd practiced saying something unbearable until it sounded almost normal. "Your ex-wife won't let you see her?" "My ex-wife thinks I'm poison." Soren's laugh was bitter as ocean spray. "Maybe she's right. I spent so many years building an empire that I forgot to build a family. When the divorce got ugly, I said things, did things. That can't be undone. Now Chloe lives in Portland with a stepfather who takes her to soccer games and helps with homework and probably doesn't even know my name." The confession settled between them like a stone dropped into deep water. Livia felt something crack open in her chest. Not pity, which would have insulted them both, but recognition. The understanding of what it felt like to lose something you'd taken for granted until it was gone. "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it. "Don't be. I earned it." He turned to face her fully, and in the moonlight, she could see the truth written in every line of his face. "But that's why I don't do this. Why I don't get involved. Don't make promises I'll break. Don't pretend to be capable of being what someone needs." "Then why tonight? Why me?" Soren reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and touched one of the dark strands of hair that had escaped from her careful arrangement. His fingers barely grazed her cheek as he tucked it behind her ear. "Because you look like someone who understands that some things can't be fixed," he said quietly. "And maybe, just for tonight, we don't have to try." The waves rushed up around their feet, colder now, pulling sand away from beneath them and making them sway slightly toward each other. Livia felt herself balanced on the edge of a decision that would either be the best or worst mistake of her life. "One night," she whispered, not sure if she was reminding him or herself. "One night," he agreed. But as they turned back toward the hotel, hands almost but not quite touching, both of them knew they were lying. The presidential suite felt too big for honesty. Soren closed the door behind them with a soft click that seemed to echo in the spacious room. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed the moonlit coastline stretching toward infinity, while inside, everything spoke of luxury designed to impress. Italian marble, handcrafted furniture, artwork that probably cost more than most people's cars. But none of it mattered when Livia turned to face him, sand still clinging to her bare feet, her carefully styled facade completely undone by wind and salt air, and something that felt dangerously close to hope. "This is beautiful," she said, though her voice suggested she was talking about more than the room. "It's borrowed," Soren replied, not moving from the door. "Like everything else I have." The admission hung between them, raw and unexpected. In the soft lamplight, she could see him clearly for the first time all evening. The expensive clothes couldn't hide the exhaustion in his shoulders, the way he held himself like a man who'd forgotten how to rest. Success looked heavy on him. "Are you having second thoughts?" she asked quietly. "Every second." His smile was rueful. "You?" "Every second." They stood there looking at each other across an ocean of Persian carpet, both paralyzed by the strange intimacy of shared uncertainty. This wasn't how these things usually went, Livia imagined. There should have been more champagne, less talking, fewer pauses to consider the weight of what they were doing. Instead, Soren walked to the window and gestured toward the view. When I was building my first wind farm, I spent 6 months in a trailer in Wyoming. No heat, no hot water, eating canned soup for dinner because the nearest restaurant was 40 miles away. Livia joined him at the window, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his body. Why are you telling me this? Because I was happier in that trailer than I've been in any penthouse since. He turned to look at her, and she saw something vulnerable flicker across his features. I keep thinking if I acquire enough, achieve enough, prove enough, I'll find my way back to that feeling. But I think I've been looking in the wrong places. What feeling? Like what I was doing mattered. Like I mattered. His voice was barely above a whisper. Like I wasn't just taking up space in someone else's life. The words hit her like a physical blow, because she knew exactly what he meant. How many contracts had she negotiated? How many deals had she closed? How many professional victories had she celebrated alone in her empty apartment, wondering if any of it added up to something that looked like a life worth living? I know that feeling, she said softly. Do you? Instead of answering with words, Livia reached for his hand. His fingers were warm, slightly rough from those old calluses, and when he didn't pull away, she led him to the sitting area where a low sofa faced the windows. They sat close but not touching, the space between them charged with possibility and fear in equal measure. Tell me about your engagement, Soren said suddenly. Why? Because I want to know what kind of man walks away from you. The question caught her off guard, partly because of its directness and partly because she realized she hadn't talked about David, really talked about him, with anyone since he'd left. The practical kind, she said finally. We met at a law conference. He was brilliant, ambitious, had a 5-year plan that included partnership, marriage, children, and a house in Marin County with a 3-car garage. She paused, remembering. It all made perfect sense on paper, but I think we were planning a merger, not a marriage. Everything was negotiated, whose career took priority, how we'd split domestic responsibilities, when we'd start trying for children. We had spreadsheets, Soren, actual spreadsheets for our relationship. What changed? Livia was quiet for a long moment, watching moonlight dance on the water. I think he finally realized I was never going to be the woman he'd planned to marry, and I realized I didn't want to be her anyway. Soren nodded like this made perfect sense to him. My ex-wife used to say I treated our marriage like another business acquisition, that I thought love was something you could optimize if you just worked hard enough at it. Was she right? Probably. His laugh was hollow. I scheduled date nights like board meetings, bought expensive gifts instead of being present. When Chloe was born, I hired a night nurse so our productivity wouldn't suffer. He ran his hands through his hair, destroying what was left of its careful styling. I turned everything beautiful into a transaction. The confession settled between them, heavy with regret and recognition. Livia found herself reaching for his hand again, needing the contact, the reminder that she wasn't the only one who'd confused achieving with living. Maybe that's why we're here, she said quietly. Maybe we're both tired of treating connection like a contract. Soren's fingers intertwined with hers, and when he spoke, his voice was rougher than before. What if I don't remember how to do this without conditions, without clauses and exit strategies? Then we figure it out together. The words surprised them both. This was supposed to be simple. One night, no complications, no promises they couldn't keep. But as Soren turned to face her fully, as his free hand came up to trace the line of her cheek, Livia realized they'd already crossed some invisible boundary into territory neither of them had mapped. Just tonight, he whispered, but it sounded more like a prayer than a promise. Just tonight, she agreed, knowing they were both lying again. But for once, neither of them cared about being right. She woke up alone, exactly as she'd expected, and somehow that made it hurt more. The first thing Livia noticed was the light. Soft California sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows, painting everything in shades of gold that made last night feel like a dream she might have imagined. The second thing she noticed was the silence. No shower running, no coffee brewing, no quiet sounds of someone trying not to wake her. Just emptiness where warmth had been. She sat up slowly, the Egyptian cotton sheets pooling around her waist, and surveyed the presidential suite that felt cavernous, now that she was alone in it. Her wine-colored dress lay draped over a chair like abandoned hope. Her heels sat exactly where she'd left them by the door, still sandy from their walk on the beach. Everything looked the same. Nothing felt the same. What did you expect, she asked herself. padding barefoot to the window where they'd stood talking about borrowed lives and broken dreams. He told you exactly what this was. One night. No complications. No promises. The rational part of her mind, the part that had spent years negotiating contracts and managing expectations, knew she had no right to feel disappointed. They'd both been clear about the terms. She'd gotten exactly what she'd agreed to. So why did her chest feel hollow, like something essential had been scooped out while she slept? Through the window, she could see the beach where they'd walked, where Soren had told her about his daughter with that careful, practiced emptiness that spoke of wounds that never quite healed, where he'd touched her face like she was something precious instead of something temporary. A memory surfaced, his voice in the darkness, rough with something that might have been vulnerability. I haven't felt this clear-headed in years. The admission had come after, when they were lying tangled together, her head on his chest, listening to his heartbeat slow to something approaching peace. Clear-headed about what? She'd whispered. About wanting to stay. But he hadn't stayed. Of course he hadn't. Livia found her phone buried in her purse and checked the time, 8:47 a.m. The wedding reception would be long over, the happy couple probably on their way to whatever exotic honeymoon they'd planned. Real life resuming its regularly scheduled programming. She should shower, get dressed, drive back to San Francisco, where her organized, predictable existence was waiting. She should treat this like what it was, a brief interlude, a moment of madness that had no bearing on her actual life. Instead, she found herself walking onto the private balcony, hoping to catch some sign of him. Maybe he was an early riser, maybe he'd gone for coffee, maybe there was some innocent explanation for why he'd disappeared before she woke up. The balcony was empty except for morning air that smelled of jasmine and salt water. But there, on the small table where room service had left champagne the night before, was something that made her breath catch. A single white gardenia, still damp with dew. Next to it, a note written on hotel stationery in handwriting that was distinctly masculine, all sharp angles and controlled urgency. You were sleeping so peacefully, I couldn't bear to wake you. Last night was unexpected. Thank you for reminding me what it feels like to be human. S. Livia sank into one of the wrought iron chairs, the note trembling slightly in her hands. It wasn't a love letter, barely qualified as a thank you note, but something about the careful script, the choice to leave anything at all, made her throat tight with emotions she couldn't name. Thank you for reminding me what it feels like to be human. She read the words again, remembering the way he'd looked at her in those quiet moments between conversation and sleep, like she was the first real thing he'd encountered in years. Like she mattered in a way that had nothing to do with what she could do for him or how she might fit into his life. When was the last time someone had looked at her like that? When was the last time she'd felt essential rather than convenient? Her phone buzzed with a text from her assistant. Conference call with Morrison Industries moved to 10 a.m. Need the Henderson contracts reviewed before Monday. Hope the wedding was fun. The message landed like a cold splash of reality. This was her life. Conference calls and contract reviews and efficiently managed obligations. This was who she was. Senior partner Livia Moore, who billed 80 hours a week and hadn't taken a real vacation in 3 years, who measured success in billable hours and client satisfaction scores. Not the woman who had walked barefoot on moonlit beaches and shared secrets with a stranger who saw her pain and somehow made it feel less heavy. She dressed quickly, mechanically, smoothing her hair back into something approximating professional order. In the bathroom mirror, she looked exactly like herself again. Composed, controlled, unremarkable. The woman from last night, the one who had laughed and cried and felt like she might finally be coming back to life, was nowhere to be seen. But as she packed her few belongings, Livia carefully tucked the gardenia and note into her purse. Not because she was harboring romantic fantasies about a man who'd made it clear this was temporary. Not because she expected to see him again, but because for 7 hours, she'd felt like someone worth staying for. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to build on. 3 weeks later, and she still couldn't drink champagne without thinking of his hands. Livia stared at the glass of Dom Perignon that had been placed in front of her at the Morrison Industries celebration dinner, watching the bubbles rise in perfect, predictable patterns. Around her, San Francisco's legal elite celebrated another successful merger, their conversations a familiar symphony of billable hours and market analysis. This was her world. These were her people. This should have felt like coming home. Instead, she felt like she was watching it all through soundproof glass. "You're distracted tonight," observed Nathaniel Blackstone, the senior partner sitting beside her. At 62, he was everything the legal profession valued: sharp, ruthless, and completely immune to sentiment. The Yamamoto contract review isn't sitting well with you? It's fine, Livia replied automatically, forcing herself to focus on his weathered face instead of the memory of dark eyes that had looked at her like she was the only real thing in a room full of artifice. Just tired. Nathaniel's expression suggested he wasn't buying it. You've been tired a lot lately. Taking longer lunches, leaving the office before 9 p.m. Your assistant mentioned you've been declining networking events. Because networking events reminded her of wedding receptions, and wedding receptions reminded her of a night when she'd felt more alive in 7 hours than she had in 7 years. I'm handling my caseload, she said carefully. Yes, but barely. And barely isn't what made you senior partner. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to the confidential tone he used for difficult conversations. Whatever's going on with you, Livia, fix it. The partners are watching, and distraction is a luxury we can't afford. The warning was delivered with the casual efficiency of a man who'd spent decades reducing human complexity to profit margins. Livia nodded, offered the appropriate reassurances, and excused herself to the ladies' room before she said something that would destroy everything she'd worked for. In the marble-appointed restroom of the St. Francis Hotel, she stared at her reflection and tried to recognize the woman looking back. Same expensive suit, same careful makeup, same professional composure that had carried her through countless high-stakes negotiations. But something was different. Something had shifted that night in Carmel, leaving her feeling like she was playing a role in someone else's life. Her phone buzzed. A text from her assistant. Soren Hayes from Hayes Energy Solutions wants to schedule a consultation. Should I set something up for next week? Livia's hands went cold. She read the message 3 times, each word hitting her like a physical blow. Soren Hayes. Here, in her professional world, where she'd spent 3 weeks trying to forget he existed. What kind of consultation? She typed back, proud of how steady her fingers remained. Didn't specify, just said he had some contracts that needed reviewing. High priority, apparently. Want me to send him to Davidson instead? She should say yes. Should hand this off to another partner and maintain the professional distance she'd spent years perfecting. Should protect herself from whatever game he was playing. Instead, she found herself typing, schedule him for Thursday at 2 p.m. The rest of the dinner passed in a blur of forced conversation and untouched food. Livia made the appropriate responses, laughed at the appropriate moments, and played the part of successful corporate attorney, while her mind raced through 1,000 scenarios. Why was he here? What did he want? And why did the thought of seeing him again make her feel like she was standing on the edge of a cliff, equally terrified of falling and jumping? By Thursday morning, she'd convinced herself she was ready. Professional composure, clear boundaries, no acknowledgement of anything that had happened outside the context of business. She'd handled difficult clients before. She could handle Soren Hayes. At exactly 2 p.m., her assistant knocked on her office door. Mr. Hayes is here for his appointment. Send him in. The door opened, and suddenly her carefully controlled world tilted sideways. He looked different in her office. Larger somehow. More commanding in the tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than most people's cars. But his eyes were the same. Dark and intense, and searching her face like he was trying to read a language he'd only just learned. Ms. Moore, he said formally, extending his hand across her mahogany desk. Thank you for seeing me on such short notice. Mr. Hayes. His handshake was brief, professional, but she felt the slight tremor in his fingers, the way he held on just a fraction too long. Please, have a seat. What can I do for you? Soren settled into the leather chair across from her desk, his posture perfect except for the tension in his shoulders that spoke of sleepless nights and difficult decisions. For a moment neither of them spoke, the weight of unfinished conversations filling the space between them. I need help with some contracts, he said finally. What kind of contracts? The complicated kind. His smile was rueful, tinged with something that might have been regret, the kind that requires someone who understands the importance of clear terms and defined boundaries. Livia felt her chest tighten. They weren't talking about business contracts, and they both knew it. I see, she said carefully. And what exactly are you hoping to negotiate, Mr. Hayes? For the first time since he'd entered her office, his professional mask slipped slightly, revealing something raw and uncertain underneath. A second chance, he said quietly, if you think the terms might be amendable. The words hung between them like a challenge, a question, a plea. She wasn't sure she was strong enough to answer. She should have felt powerful, saying no. Instead, she felt like she was drowning. Livia kept her expression perfectly neutral, the way she'd learned during years of high-stakes negotiations where showing weakness meant losing everything. But inside, his words echoed like a bell she couldn't stop hearing. A second chance, if you think the terms might be amendable. I'm sorry, Mr. Hayes, she said, her voice crisp and professional. I don't think I'm the right attorney for what you're looking for. Something flickered across his face. Disappointment, maybe, or the particular kind of pain that comes from hoping for something you know you don't deserve. But he recovered quickly, his own mask sliding back into place with practiced efficiency. I see. He straightened in his chair, every inch the successful businessman who'd heard no before and survived it. May I ask why? Because you left me sleeping alone in a bed that still smelled like you. Because you made me feel human again and then disappeared like it meant nothing. Because I can't look at you without remembering what it felt like to matter to someone, and I can't afford to want that again. Because I don't mix business with personal matters, she said instead. And what happened in Carmel was a lapse in judgment that I prefer not to repeat. The words landed like physical blows. She could see it in the way his jaw tightened, the way his hands went very still on the arms of his chair. For a moment the polished veneer cracked, and she glimpsed the man who'd stood on a moonlit beach telling her about his daughter, about the loneliness that success couldn't cure. A lapse in judgment, he repeated slowly, tasting the phrase like it was bitter medicine. Is that what you call it? What would you call it? The question came out sharper than she'd intended, revealing the anger she'd been burying for 3 weeks. A beautiful connection? A meaningful encounter? You were gone before I woke up, Soren. You got exactly what you asked for. One night, no complications, no promises. So please don't come into my office now pretending it meant something more. The use of his first name was a mistake. Too intimate, too revealing. It cracked something open between them that should have stayed safely buried under professional courtesy. You're right, he said quietly. I was gone before you woke up, and I've regretted it every day since. Don't. The word came out like a warning. Don't do this here. Don't make this about regret or second chances or whatever midlife crisis brought you to my office. I'm a contracts attorney, Mr. Hayes. I deal in facts, not feelings. And the fact is, you made your choice that morning. Soren stood slowly, and for a moment she thought he was going to leave, walk out of her office and her life with the same silent efficiency he'd used to leave her hotel room. Instead, he moved to the window that overlooked San Francisco's financial district, his hands clasped behind his back like a man preparing for battle. You want facts? He said without turning around. Here's a fact. I haven't been able to get through a single day without thinking about you. Another fact. I've driven past your building 17 times in the last 3 weeks trying to work up the courage to come inside. And here's the most inconvenient fact of all. I think I'm falling in love with a woman who's too smart to let me. The admission hit her like a punch to the solar plexus. She gripped the edge of her desk, fighting the urge to either throw something at him or run from the room entirely. Stop, she whispered. I can't. He turned back to face her, and she saw that his careful composure was completely gone now, replaced by something raw and desperate, and entirely too honest. I've tried, Livia. God knows I've tried. But that night, what we shared, it wasn't just sex or loneliness or whatever comfortable lie we want to call it. It was real. Maybe the most real thing that's ever happened to me. It was one night. But even as she said it, she could hear the uncertainty in her own voice. Then why are you afraid to look at me? He asked gently. Why haven't you made eye contact once since I walked into this office? Because looking at him hurt. Because she could see everything she wanted and couldn't have written in the lines around his eyes, in the way he held himself like a man who'd learned not to expect mercy from the world. I honor contracts, she said finally, forcing herself to meet his gaze. You asked for one night, and I gave it to you. That was the deal. Everything else is just wishful thinking. Then let me propose new terms. No, Livia, no. She stood up, needing the authority that came with height, with the imposing presence of her mahogany desk and law degrees and all the trappings of success she'd assembled like armor. I won't do this again. I won't be someone's experiment in feeling human. I won't be the woman you think about when your regular life gets too empty or too complicated. That's not what this is. Isn't it? She moved around the desk, closing the distance between them until she could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes, until she was close enough to remember exactly what his hands felt like on her skin. You want to know what I think, Mr. Hayes? I think you're bored. I think your life feels meaningless and you've decided that one night with a stranger made it better, so obviously the answer is more nights with the same stranger. But I'm not a prescription for your existential crisis. The words came out harsher than she'd intended, designed to hurt because hurting him felt like the only way to protect herself, and they worked. She could see it in the way he stepped back, in the careful way he rebuilt his walls right in front of her. "You're right," he said after a long moment. "I'm sorry. This was inappropriate. Thank you for your time, Ms. Moore." He moved toward the door with the same controlled precision he'd shown when he entered, but something about his retreat felt final in a way that made her chest tight with panic. Soren, wait. But he was already gone, leaving nothing behind but the faint scent of his cologne, and the echo of words she couldn't take back. Livia sank into her chair, staring at the door he'd closed so carefully behind him, and wondered why winning felt so much like losing everything that mattered. 2 weeks of perfect productivity, and she'd never felt more empty in her life. Livia stared at her computer screen, where the Henderson merger documents glowed in neat, orderly paragraphs that made perfect sense and felt completely meaningless. Around her, the law firm hummed with its usual controlled chaos, associates rushing between offices with armloads of files, partners barking orders into phones, the steady rhythm of success measured in billable hours and client satisfaction. She should have been proud. Her productivity was back to pre-Carmel levels, maybe even higher. She'd closed 3 major deals in 10 days, earned praise from Nathaniel Blackstone, and received a bonus that would cover her mortgage for the next 6 months. Everything was exactly as it should be. So why did she feel like she was slowly suffocating? Ms. Moore, her assistant Janet, appeared in the doorway holding a package. "This came for you by special delivery. No return address, but it was marked personal and confidential." Livia accepted the package with the polite efficiency she'd perfected over years of professional interactions. But something about the weight of it, the careful way it had been wrapped, made her pulse quicken. The handwriting on the label was distinctly masculine, all sharp angles and controlled urgency that she recognized with a jolt of something that felt dangerously close to hope. "Thank you, Janet. Please hold my calls for the next hour." Alone in her office, Livia set the package on her desk and stared at it like it might explode. For 2 weeks, she'd convinced herself she'd done the right thing. Soren Hayes was a complication she couldn't afford, a risk that could derail everything she'd worked for. She was better off without him, but her hands trembled slightly as she unwrapped the package, revealing a small wooden box and an envelope sealed with old-fashioned wax. Inside the envelope, a single sheet of letterhead from Hayes Energy Solutions, but the content was entirely personal. "Ms. Moore, I know you said you honor contracts, so I'm submitting this proposal for your consideration. Please review the terms carefully. The Soren Hayes Amendment to Previous Agreements, Clause 1. I want all your mornings, not just one night. I want to wake up next to you and watch you drink coffee while you read the news on your phone. I want to learn whether you're grumpy before caffeine and what you look like when you're not performing for the world. Clause 2. I am willing to be broken if it means feeling again. You accused me of using you as a prescription for my existential crisis, and maybe you were right, but you're not medicine, you're transformation. You showed me what it feels like to be human instead of just successful. Clause 3. You don't have to accept these terms, but if you do, I swear I will learn how to stay. I will learn how to be present instead of just present tense. I will learn the difference between acquiring someone and earning them. Clause 4. I've already started. I called my ex-wife yesterday and asked if I could take Chloe to dinner next month. It's the first step toward becoming the father I should have been, the man I want to be when you look at me. Clause 5. This isn't about filling emptiness. This is about discovering I'm not as empty as I thought. There's something in me worth saving, and somehow you found it in the dark. If you find these terms acceptable, I'll be waiting at Pier 39 on Saturday at 2 p.m. by the Sea Lions. If not, I understand. Some contracts can't be negotiated. Either way, thank you for showing me what it feels like to want something more than I want to protect myself. Yours, if you'll have me. S.H. Livia read the letter 3 times, each word hitting her like a small electric shock. This wasn't the polished businessman who'd sat in her office 2 weeks ago. This was the man from the moonlit beach, the one who'd told her about his daughter with devastating honesty, who'd made her feel like the most important person in a room full of strangers. With shaking hands, she opened the wooden box, and inside, nestled in black velvet, was a first edition copy of To Kill a Mockingbird. The book she'd mentioned loving during their long conversation that night, when they'd talked about justice and moral courage and the difference between law and justice. A small card was tucked inside the front cover. For someone who understands that the best contracts are written in hope, not fear. S. Livia sank into her chair, the book cradled in her hands like something precious and fragile. He'd listened, really listened, not just to her words but to the dreams underneath them, the idealism she'd buried under years of corporate pragmatism. Her phone buzzed. A text from Janet. The Morrison team needs the revised contracts by 5 p.m. Should I tell them you're still in your meeting? She looked at her computer screen where those neat, orderly paragraphs waited for her attention. Important work. Valuable work. The kind of work that had defined her entire adult life. Then she looked at the letter in her hands, at clauses written in vulnerability instead of legal jargon, at terms that had nothing to do with billable hours and everything to do with building something real. For the first time in 2 weeks, Livia felt like she could breathe. She picked up her phone and typed, "Cancel my appointments for the rest of the day. Something important just came up." Then she read the letter one more time, paying special attention to Clause 4, to the part about him calling his ex-wife, about taking steps to become the father his daughter deserved. This wasn't about her being his salvation. This was about two broken people choosing to be brave enough to heal together. Saturday was 3 days away. 3 days to decide whether she was willing to risk everything she'd built for the chance at something she'd never imagined possible. 3 days to decide whether she was brave enough to sign the most important contract of her life. She changed her mind 14 times on the drive to Pier 39, and kept driving anyway. Saturday afternoon traffic crawled through San Francisco like molasses, giving Livia far too much time to second-guess every decision that had led her here. In the passenger seat, Soren's letter lay open to Clause 3. "You don't have to accept these terms," the words blurring slightly as her hands trembled on the steering wheel. "What are you doing?" The rational part of her mind, the part that had guided every major decision of her adult life, was practically screaming. "You have a career, a reputation, a carefully constructed life that makes sense. You don't throw that away for a man you've known for one night." But there was another voice, quieter but more insistent, that had been growing stronger since she'd read his letter 3 days ago. The voice that remembered how it felt to matter to someone, to be seen as more than a collection of professional achievements and social expectations. The voice that whispered, "What if this is your only chance at something real?" She'd spent the last 3 days in a state of controlled chaos. Wednesday, she'd drafted her resignation letter, then deleted it. Thursday, she'd called in sick for the first time in 2 years, spent the day walking through Golden Gate Park trying to think clearly. Friday, she'd worked until midnight, throwing herself into contracts and negotiations with desperate efficiency, as if billing enough hours could somehow solve the equation of her heart. None of it had worked. The letter remained on her nightstand, impossible to ignore, impossible to forget. Now, as she turned onto Jefferson Street and caught her first glimpse of the bay, Livia felt her pulse accelerate. The afternoon sun painted everything gold. The water, the distant hills, the tourist-crowded pier where families fed sea lions and street performers entertained crowds with varying degrees of success. She parked 3 blocks away, needing the walk to steady her nerves. Each step felt simultaneously like moving toward something inevitable and running toward the edge of a cliff with no certainty of what lay below. Clause 4, she reminded herself. He called his ex-wife. He's trying to rebuild his relationship with his daughter. This wasn't about her fixing him or him completing her. This was about 2 adults choosing to be brave enough to build something together. The sea lions were loud today, their barking echoing across the wooden planks as tourists snapped photos and children squealed with delight. Livia navigated through the crowd, her heart hammering against her ribs, scanning faces for the one that had been haunting her dreams for 6 weeks. She saw him before he saw her. Soren stood at the far end of the viewing area, hands shoved deep in the pockets of dark jeans and a gray sweater that made him look younger, less intimidating than the suited businessman who'd sat in her office. His hair was slightly mussed by the bay breeze, and there was something in his posture, a carefully controlled tension, that suggested he was as nervous as she was. He was alone. Of course he was alone. But somehow she'd half expected him not to be here, to have given up, to have decided that waiting for a woman who'd already rejected him once wasn't worth the risk. Instead, he was checking his watch with the careful precision of someone who understood that some moments couldn't be late for. Livia took a deep breath, tasting salt air and possibility. and walked toward him. He turned when she was still 10 feet away, as if some invisible thread connected them across the crowded pier. For a moment, neither of them moved. They just stood there looking at each other while families and couples and street performers swirled around them like water around stones. "You came," he said finally, and his voice carried a note of wonder that made her chest tight. "I almost didn't." The honesty surprised her, but everything about this felt too important for polite lies. "I changed my mind at least a dozen times on the way here. But you're here. I'm here." She moved closer, close enough to see the exhaustion around his eyes, the way he held himself like a man who'd been holding his breath for days. "Your letter, the contract. Too much? Terrifying." She smiled, despite herself. "But also, beautiful. No one's ever written me clauses before. I figured I should speak your language." They were close enough now that she could have reached out and touched him, could have closed the distance that had felt impossible just moments before. Instead, they stood there in the space between decision and action, both of them aware that whatever happened next would change everything. "I have questions," Livia said finally. "I have answers. Maybe not good ones, but honest ones. Your daughter, Chloe, did you really call your ex-wife?" Something shifted in his expression, vulnerability mixed with something that might have been hope. "I did. We're having dinner next Friday. Just the three of us. First time in 2 years." He paused. "She's nervous about meeting me. Her stepfather has been more of a father to her than I ever was. That must be hard." "It is, but it's also a beginning. A chance to earn something I thought I'd lost forever." He looked at her intently. "Kinda like this." Around them, the afternoon crowd continued their leisurely exploration of the pier, oblivious to the fact that two people were standing at the crossroads of their entire future. A street musician played guitar nearby, something soft and hopeful that seemed to underscore the moment. "I'm scared," Livia admitted. "So am I. I don't know how to do this. How to want something this much without guarantees." "Neither do I." Soren took a half step closer, and now they were definitely in each other's space, definitely past the point where this could be dismissed as a casual conversation. "But I know I want to try. With you, if you're willing." She looked into his dark eyes, seeing her own fear reflected there, along with something else. A determination that had nothing to do with business acquisitions and everything to do with the kind of courage that builds lives worth living. "Okay," she said quietly, the same word she'd whispered on a moonlit terrace 6 weeks ago. But this time, it felt less like surrender and more like choosing to jump. "Okay, okay." She reached for his hand, fingers intertwining with his like they'd been designed to fit together. "Let's negotiate some new terms." His smile was brilliant, transformative, the expression of a man who'd just been offered something he'd been afraid to hope for. "I was hoping you'd say that." They walked away from the crowds, toward the hardest conversation of their lives. Hand in hand, they found a quiet bench overlooking the bay, where the Golden Gate Bridge stretched across the water like a promise written in steel and dreams. The tourist chaos of Pier 39 faded behind them, replaced by the gentler sounds of waves lapping against wooden pilings and seagulls calling to each other in the salt-tinged air. But neither of them was looking at the view. They were looking at each other with the careful intensity of people who understood that the next hour would determine whether they were building something beautiful or setting themselves up for the kind of heartbreak that leaves permanent scars. "Before we negotiate anything," Livia said, her fingers tightening around his, "I need you to know something. I'm terrified of becoming someone's project." Soren turned to face her fully, his expression serious. "What do you mean?" "My ex-fiancé, David, he spent 3 years trying to optimize me, suggesting better clothes, more strategic career moves, ways I could be more useful to his ambitions." She paused, gathering courage for the harder admission. "And I let him. I thought if I could just become the right version of myself, he'd love me enough to stay. But he left anyway. He left anyway. And I realized I'd spent so much time becoming what he wanted that I'd forgotten who I actually was." She looked out at the water where a ferry was making its way toward Alcatraz. "I can't do that again, Soren. I can't be your redemption project, the woman who fixes your relationship with your daughter and teaches you how to feel human. That's not fair to either of us." The words hung between them, heavy with the weight of past wounds and future possibilities. For a moment, Soren was quiet, processing not just what she'd said, but what she was really asking him. "You're right," he said finally. "And I need you to know something too. I'm terrified of becoming someone's mistake." She looked at him sharply, surprised by the raw honesty in his voice. "My ex-wife used to say I was like a beautiful house with no foundation. Impressive from the outside, but not safe to live in. He ran his free hand through his hair, messing it further. She was right. I built this empire, accumulated all these successes, but I never learned how to be present for the people who mattered. When our marriage fell apart, when I lost Chloe, I told myself it was because I was working too hard, traveling too much. But the truth is I was a coward. Soren, no, let me finish. I was a coward who chose work over family because work was easier. Deals made sense. Contracts had clear terms. People were messy and complicated and required something I didn't know how to give. He turned to look at her and she could see years of guilt and regret written in the lines around his eyes. I'm terrified that you're going to figure out that I'm still that person. That underneath all this talk about change and second chances, I'm still the man who ruins everything he touches. The confession settled between them like a stone dropped into deep water, sending ripples through everything they thought they knew about this moment. Livia felt something crack open in her chest, not the romantic flutter of new attraction, but something deeper and more dangerous. Understanding. So we're both scared, she said quietly. Terrified. Good. The word surprised them both. I think we should be scared. This matters too much not to be scary. Around them, the afternoon light was starting to change, taking on the golden quality that made San Francisco look like a city painted in honey and dreams. Families walked past pushing strollers. Couples held hands as they watched the sunset. Joggers pounded along the waterfront path, all of them living their own versions of complicated, imperfect, beautiful human lives. I have a confession, Livia said suddenly. Tell me. That night in Carmel, it wasn't just about being lonely or wanting to feel something again. You asked me to be yours for one night, and for the first time in years, someone was asking for me. Not the lawyer, not the high achiever, not the woman who had her life together. Just me. Tears she'd been holding back for weeks finally spilled over. Do you know how long it's been since someone wanted just me? Soren's thumb brushed away the tears on her cheek with infinite gentleness. Do you know how long it's been since I wanted to be worthy of someone like you? Don't put me on a pedestal. I'm not some perfect woman who's going to save you from yourself. I don't want you to save me. His voice was rough with emotion. I want you to choose me. Every day. Even on the days when I'm difficult or distant or struggling to remember how to be the man I want to be for you. And I want you to choose me. Even when I'm demanding or controlling or so scared of being hurt that I push you away before you can leave first. They sat there looking at each other, two broken people who'd somehow found each other in a world full of strangers, both of them understanding that love, real love, wasn't about finding someone perfect. It was about finding someone worth fighting for, worth growing with, worth becoming better alongside. So what do we do now? Soren asked. We start small, Livia said, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. We have dinner. We talk about things that don't matter and things that matter too much. We figure out if we can be friends before we try to be anything else. Friends. Friends who are wildly attracted to each other and have already seen each other naked, but still. Friends first. His laugh was surprised and genuine, the sound of a man who'd forgotten what it felt like to find joy in simple moments. I'd like that. I'd like to be your friend, Livia Moore. And maybe, she said, leaning closer until their foreheads almost touched. If we're very lucky, and very careful, and very brave, maybe we can figure out how to be something more. Maybe we can. As the sun began to set over San Francisco Bay, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that made everything look possible, two people who'd thought they were too broken for love decided to risk everything on the chance that broken things could still be beautiful when they found the right person to be broken with. It wasn't a happy ending. It was something better, a hopeful beginning written in truth instead of fantasy, built on the understanding that the best love stories aren't about perfect people finding each other. They're about imperfect people choosing each other again and again, until choosing becomes as natural as breathing. 2 years later, she still returned to the same place, but this time, with a light smile and steady steps. The presidential suite at the Highlands Inn looked exactly the same, Italian marble gleaming under soft lamplight, floor-to-ceiling windows revealing the endless Pacific, handcrafted furniture arranged with mathematical precision. But everything felt different when you weren't running from yourself. Livia stood at the window where she'd once felt like a stranger in her own life, watching waves crash against the rocks below with their ancient, comforting rhythm. Behind her, Soren emerged from the bathroom, his hair damp from the shower, wearing the kind of comfortable clothes that spoke of a man who'd learned the difference between looking successful and being content. "She's nervous about tomorrow," he said, settling beside her and following her gaze to the moonlit coastline. "Of course she is. 9-year-olds are supposed to be nervous about meeting their father's girlfriend for the first time." Livia leaned into his warmth, marveling at how natural the gesture had become. "I'm nervous too. Chloe's going to love you. What if she doesn't? What if she thinks I'm trying to replace her mother? What if—" "Hey," Soren turned her to face him, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "Remember what we decided about borrowing trouble from tomorrow?" Livia smiled despite her anxiety. It was something they'd learned in couples therapy. Dr. Martinez's patient voice reminding them that most of their fears lived in imagined futures, not present realities. "We deal with today's problems today. And today's only problem is whether we want room service or that little Italian place down the street for dinner." "Italian place, definitely." She paused, studying his face in the lamplight. "You're different when you talk about her now, about Chloe. Different how? Present. Like you're talking about your daughter instead of your guilt." It had taken 18 months of careful rebuilding, of supervised visits that gradually became weekend trips, of a 9-year-old girl slowly learning to trust a father who'd finally learned how to stay. The process had been messy, imperfect, sometimes heartbreaking, nothing like the neat redemption arc movies promised. But it had been real. "She asked me last week if you were going to be her stepmom," Soren said quietly. Livia's breath caught. "What did you tell her?" "I told her that you and I are still figuring out what we mean to each other, but that regardless of what happens between us, I hope you'll always be part of her life. Because you make her dad better, and she deserves the best version of me I can manage." The words settled between them, honest and unvarnished and completely free of the desperate promises they'd both learned to distrust. This was what they'd built instead of fairy tale romance. Something steadier, more valuable, a love that didn't require perfection, only presence. "I have something for you," Livia said suddenly, moving to her purse on the nightstand. "It's not my birthday. It's better than a birthday." She pulled out a folded document, official-looking and sealed with the kind of precision that spoke of legal weight. "I finally did it. I filed the paperwork yesterday." Soren took the document with careful hands, scanning the legal language with growing amazement. "Livia, this is my resignation from Blackstone and Associates, effective in 6 weeks." She couldn't keep the excitement out of her voice. "I'm starting my own practice, family law mostly. Pro bono work for people who can't afford representation in custody cases. This is huge. This is everything you've been talking about for months. Scared, terrified, but the good kind of terrified." She moved back to the window, looking out at the endless Pacific that had witnessed so many of their important conversations. "Remember what you said that first night? About feeling clear-headed? I remember. I finally understand what you meant. For the first time in my adult life, I know who I am when I'm not performing for anyone else." She turned back to him, and in the soft light, she looked like the woman he'd fallen in love with, not despite her imperfections, but because of her courage to be imperfect out loud. "I'm someone who believes justice shouldn't depend on your bank account. Someone who thinks love is worth the risk, even when it's complicated. Someone who wants to build something meaningful instead of just something impressive." Soren crossed the room in 3 strides, pulling her into his arms with the desperate tenderness of a man who'd learned not to take beautiful moments for granted. "I love you," he said against her hair. "Not the lawyer, not the achievement, not the woman who has everything figured out. Just you, especially you. Even when I'm demanding and controlling and so scared of losing this that I sometimes push you away. Especially then, because that's when you need me most." They held each other in the golden lamplight, 2 people who'd learned that love wasn't about finding someone to complete you. It was about finding someone brave enough to be incomplete with you, someone willing to keep choosing growth over comfort, truth over convenience. Outside, waves continued their eternal conversation with the shore, indifferent to human struggles and triumphs. But inside the presidential suite where it all began, 2 hearts that had almost given up on love were quietly writing the kind of ending that mattered, not because it was perfect, but because it was real. Later, much later, as they lay tangled together in Egyptian cotton sheets, Livia traced lazy patterns on Soren's chest and asked the question that had been haunting her for weeks. "Do you think we would have found each other if we hadn't been broken first?" He was quiet for so long she thought he'd fallen asleep. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful, wondering. I think maybe we had to break before we could learn how to bend. Maybe that's what real love is. Not finding someone who doesn't have any pieces missing, but finding someone whose broken places fit with yours. Like a puzzle, like a home. In the morning, they would drive to Portland to pick up a 9-year-old girl who was nervous about meeting her father's girlfriend. There would be awkward conversations and careful negotiations and the messy, beautiful work of blending lives that had existed separately for too long. But tonight, in a room that had once witnessed the end of their old lives, they simply held each other and marveled at the fact that sometimes, if you're very lucky and very brave, endings can become beginnings. And sometimes the best contracts are the ones written in whispered promises in the dark, sealed not with signatures, but with the simple, revolutionary act of choosing to stay. Have you ever been brave enough to love someone not despite their broken pieces, but because of their courage to be imperfect out loud? Your participation in our channel is very important. Please leave your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the story, please subscribe to our channel and leave a comment below letting us know what you thought. Your feedback and support mean a lot to us. Stay tuned for more exciting stories.